Well, that's okay. Mommy, why don't you go ahead and start saying where you were born? You were born in Brünn, right? In Czechoslovakia.
Yes.
But it was the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia.
No, no. We were just Austrian population that lived in the middle of Czechoslovakia.
Okay.
There's also the Sudeten Germans, but we were not Sudeten Germans. We were just Austrians in Czechoslovakia.
And you were born in
I was born. Yes,
In
in 1933.
In 1933.
In 1933.
Okay.
Which means, since you want to have the big context, which means half a year into the Empire of the Thousand Years.
Which is the Third Reich.
Which is the Third Reich.
So, okay.
Which began in January of 1933.
Right, okay.
And I was born in September.
Right.
So therefore, it had already started.
And the Austrians living in that part of Czechoslovakia were extremely pro-German because...
Of course, yes. Because there had been a great deal of friction between the Czechoslovakian population and the Austrian population, the German-speaking population.
So the rise of German nationalism was very welcome. And so you were growing up, your parents also embraced that. Is that right?
Well, my parents were not unanimous.
Okay.
My mother was a lot more
willing to
comply than my father was. My father was very left.
Your father was?
My father was.
Really interesting. So Großvater was left-leaning and liberal,
Yes.
and your mother embraced the Nazi ideals.
Conservative, traditionalist, Austrian, bourgeois type of mother.
Both Catholic?
Oh, that didn't mean much.
They weren't very religious.
Didn't mean much because in Austria, Catholicism is just part of the culture.
Right.
It's
So everybody's Catholic, but nobody really cares. Is that
exactly,
the idea?
That's
So they weren't they weren't
Well,
particularly religious then.
No, it
And
was
when-
a cultural thing.
Interesting. So when Nazism came along, maybe that attitude helped the Nazis because people weren't clinging to their religion. And when the Nazis came along with an alternative, people were quick to drop their old religion. And so your father was left-leaning anyway, and your mother was where were your parents from? Were they originally from Austria proper?
No, they were also born in Brünn, but there's always been back. It's only 100 kilometers away from Vienna,
Right.
which is an hour's train ride.
Right.
And today it's less than an hour by car, right? It's less than an hour by car. So, you know, there have been aunts and uncles and relatives in Vienna, so that Brünn practically was a suburb of Vienna.
So what do you know about your father's parents?
Ooh, they're very interesting because they're scandalous. They're very scandalous people because my father's father, he won't even talk about it. That's how he feels about it still.
Großvater's, okay.
Großvater's father was an illegitimate child. And guess who his father was? He was an archbishop of the Catholic Church. And apparently in Olmütz, yeah. He was an Archbishop Olmütz, which is another big
supposed to be celibate.
Yeah. Well, she was supposed to be celibate, and some housekeeper.
Oh, that's interesting. So it was an archbishop and a housekeeper that
And
merged and created Großvater.
My great-grandfather. His father.
Oh,
Your
okay.
Your grandfather.
So how did he lead his life then? He was an illegitimate child, so he
was
probably...
an illegitimate child, and he was given an inn to run an inn. So he had a big inn.
And this was in Brünn or in Vienna?
No, that was in Brünn.
Okay. So
And
they go...
He had a
Okay.
big Gasthaus.
Interesting.
He had a big Gasthaus, and he had 4 children. One of them was my father. And my father is still extremely embarrassed about all these things, and he would never have talked about it. But during the Third Reich, everybody had to have proof that they weren't Jewish. So
Right.
everybody had to have a so-called Ahnenpass,
Ancestry.
which meant you had to show your
Pedigree.
ancestry,
Pedigree.
basically, because this is how they thought. And while everybody needed these pedigrees, all kinds of horrible things came out in every
Came to
family.
light.
All sorts of skeletons from the closet came
All the skeletons
rattling
came
out.
out of the closets. Yeah.
Interesting. So, okay, now,
So
how did your father grow up then? He had 3 brothers?
No, he had 1 brother and 2 sisters.
Großvater had 1 brother and 2 sisters.
Yes.
Okay, and how did the illegitimate child of the bishop raise his 4 children?
Strictly.
Very strictly.
Very strict bourgeois
They
upbringing.
still had to say-
They
They still had to say Sie to their parents.
Aha, very
Herr Vater.
authoritarian.
Herr
Herr
Vater.
Vater.
Yeah, Fata,
Herr
very
Vater,
interesting.
they would have to say, yes.
Lord Father.
Lord Vater.
Mhm.
Yes, but I did know him. He died before I was born.
So you never met your
I
grandfather?
never met this illegitimate son.
Grandfather.
of
Easy now.
bishops. No, I
Um,
met him. He died before I was.
And who did he marry? Who was your father's mother?
My father's mother was her name was Christine Weniger, and
She didn't speak German.
she spoke broken German. Her maiden name was Kral, which also indicates that she was of aristocratic origin. That that bishop, most likely, I never looked into it, but most likely he was a Habsburg descendant, because very many times the younger sons of the Habsburgs became
The bishop
bishops of
Olmütz.
Olmütz. So we may have just a few drops of Habsburg blood in our...
Bastard Habsburg.
Oh yeah, Driftwood, Habsburg, Driftwood.
Good, wouldn't want it any other way. Let me see.
But my father is still very, very...
So
very
she was a blue blood now.
No, not really. She was also kind of mixed.
Your father's, but she was Czechoslovakian speaking. She
She was
spoke
Czech.
Czechoslovakian.
She was, yeah, she was...
Okay. So okay. What did she do for a living? What did she do for a living?
She had a German name, Weniger.
What did she do for a living? Was she just a housewife?
Oh, she was just a housewife.
So okay, it was a very.
Who was the Kral? Was that not her maiden?
That's her name.
But that was her maiden name. Then Weniger was the name of your grandfather. That was the name that she took when she married your grandfather. And so
My
Weniger.
grandfather's name was Stolper.
Well then, how can she? Who was Weniger and who was Kral? Kral must have been her mother's name.
Right. Her mother's name was Kral.
Was Kral. Yeah.
That's where the Czech aristocracy comes from.
Ah,
Right,
okay.
right.
Well, okay. It's good that we got that.
Her
worked out.
father's name was Weniger, and that's good in German.
Her name was German.
And then
German.
Stolpa was the name originally of the
Of
housekeeper.
the housekeeper.
Okay, so what I'm interested in knowing now is what happened to your father's siblings. What happened to your father's 2 brothers and 2 sisters and brother? Whatever became of them?
Well, Tante Linchiko died when we were...
That was Tante Lynchy. Okay,
Tante
I've met
Lynchy,
her.
Her name was Eleanor. Tante Lynchy was basically also a housewife, and
and then the
she also she must have had some sort of training, because she worked in an office somewhere or other, and then I don't know.
And the other was that aunt whom I met once at the...
Tante Fanny, she's still alive. She
Tante
lives in.
Fanny.
She's as old as my father, and she lives in Karlsruhe. She's still alive.
She lives in Karlsruhe.
Yes.
I never met her.
Tante Fanny.
Okay,
What
and
about
so
your
what
father?
about what
My
about
father's father was also called Paul D. Leopold, and
His brother. This is his brother.
what did he do for a living?
I don't know. I just
Okay,
know.
Leopold, brother. Okay, Ludwig's
Both
brother
my mother
Leopold.
and my father had a brother by the name of Leopold. So,
Okay.
So my brother Leopold has 2 uncles by the name of Leopold.
Now let's talk about your mother.
Practically.
How did your father, and so now we know a little bit about your father. How did your father and your mother meet?
Heavens, I don't know. They belong to some kind of a hiking Jugendbewegt type of a mountain climbing club.
Of course, this was before the rise of the Third Reich, so this was
I just
pre-Third
said.
Reich youth hiking club, and
No,
so
it was
they.
in the 20s.
Okay,
was
so
in the
this was in the
20s.
20s,
That was in the 20s when everybody was Jugendbewegt. And so they
right?
were Jugendbewegt also, and they hiked and danced and did all kinds of, I don't know.
And do you know what kind of people they were then?
I don't. I didn't know them.
Father was more Czechish really than German.
In his orientation, in
No,
his
you can't- no,
culturally.
you can't say that. That's not true.
He was in the Czechish army before he turned into
Why?
an army.
Because at that time, Brünn was Czechish. It switched back and forth all the time. All the Austrians had to go and join the Czech army in those days.
Oh.
No, he was not particularly Czechish at all. No.
So he was more German,
Yes,
and
so
she was very German. Now they met at a Jugend hiking rally type situation. Where did she come from? And who was she?
My mother,
Yeah,
my mother's maiden name was Papish,
Popish.
which means Pope.
Uh-huh.
And
It's a Czech name, but she was German.
which means yeah, Weniger. My grandmother Weniger
Had a German name,
had a
but she
German
was
and
Czech.
Czechish,
And
and my
Papish has a
mother's
Czech name,
family
but she was
it was
German.
Papish, and they had a Czech name, and they were German.
Yeah.
So this is the way it was
Yeah.
in Britain. Everything was mixed. At any rate, my mother was the second child of 3 children,
Mm-hmm.
and her brother, Leopold, was killed in the First World War.
Oh.
He was a young genius musician, he was an architecture student. And her sister, my aunt Gretel, was a sort of a real, what do you call a suffragette or whatever in those days, right? My mother was born in 1901, and her older sister was born in the 19th century, so at the very end of the 19th century. So she was one of the first suffragettes. She was a very educated woman. She taught teachers.
Who did this now? Your mother or your mother's sister?
My mother's sister.
Okay, now
My
what about
mother's
your mother? What did your mother do? Was she educated?
Yes.
Okay. She went, where did she go to school? In Brünn?
Oh, in Brünn, oh,
Okay.
Brünn. Yeah, she was fairly educated as far as education would go in these days.
What did she
aunt
have her
was
education in?
My mother was not as exceptional as my aunt, but my aunt was just like Aunt Margaret. Aunt Margaret, you know, your mother's
Yeah.
sister. She was very exceptional, and my mother was sort of ordinary. She finished school, and then she was a journalist.
Uh-huh.
But she didn't do that for very long, because when she met my father, my brother was born, and that was the end of her journalism. But she was very differentiated and sophisticated woman.
So was she a real knockout as far as looker, or was she?
Yeah, and she was very beautiful.
She was very beautiful. So she had.
Yes, my mother was very beautiful. When I was about 15 or 16, people would always say, "Where's your mother?" And I would say, "Well, that's your mother." They would always say, "You're the daughter."
What happened to you? Because she's so beautiful. What happened to you?
Yes.
No, because I've seen pictures of you when you were very young. In fact, I'd like for you to send me some of those. They were very interesting. Particularly the one of you sitting down with the bicycle. But let's go on. So your mother would it be fair to say that she was a beautiful, educated socialite from Brünn?
She was not a social. I don't think that she was a social.
Well, she was conservative, though. She was
That's
conservative, and for that. Now, how old was she when you were born?
32. Well,
Is that right?
No, she was born in 1901, and I was born in 33. So
There you go, 33. Okay, or 32. Yeah.
32.
And let me see. I have so many questions. They're fighting for the use of my vocal cords. You only have one brother. That's Paul D.
Mm-hmm.
Paul D was born before you, so Paul D's older than you, right?
A lot older. He's 7.5 years old.
So there's a 7-year break in between.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And your parents got married. It was really kind of an odd. She's a very beautiful, educated socialite. Your father has no formal education. Is that right?
Well, he sort of got himself into positions. Right now, I mean, if I tell people that he lit the opera, you know, he did all the electrical work.
All the electric work for the opera.
For the opera in Vienna, for instance, he did absolutely every wire in the opera there has been.
Well, he directed it.
He directed
He didn't
it,
do
yeah.
it himself.
So
It's
I
a
mean,
responsible position.
he got himself into very important positions.
Where did he learn to be an electrician?
In Brünn?
In Brünn? Did he get his training from the military?
No.
Did he go to school to learn to become an electrician?
Yeah, he went to a trade school.
Did he go to a trade school? He fought in the First World War, right?
No, he was
It
too
was
young.
1901. He
was
was
too young.
17 when the war was over.
Is that right? So he did not fight in the First World War
No,
then?
he didn't.
Okay, but he went to a trade school after the First World War.
My mother's brother was the only one.
Your mother's brother is the only one that fought in the First World War.
But he didn't fight much. He just got typhoid fever, I think, and died.
Ooh, so he died from...
Yeah, he died.
Okay.
He never came back. He was a very young man, probably about 21. So.
Okay, so then so he becomes an electrician and marries your mother. They met at a youth rally. What about your mother's background? Where did she come from? What was her family background? Do you know anything about her parents?
I know a lot. I know a lot about my family's, my mother's background because my grandparents were practically the ones who raised me.
Okay, so you were much closer with your mother's side of the family than you
Well,
were
of course,
with.
because my parents were divorced. They got divorced when I was, in those days, that was a real event
Uh-huh.
to get divorced. I mean, that was a real something that wasn't a common thing to do.
It was a scandal.
You know. Yeah, with this.
How old were you when your parents divorced?
5.5.
Oh, so you were young.
Yeah.
And you stayed with your mother.
Yes.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And and your mother moved back in with her mother and took the child with her?
No, we lived alone.
Uh-huh. But you lived in close proximity. She lived in close proximity to her mother.
To her parents.
To her parents.
Her mother had died by then, and my grandfather had married a second time.
Ah.
And my actual grandmother, I don't know, but the second wife of my grandfather, I was very close to, and she was very nice to me, and she was very kind.
Mm-hmm. And so you were 5 years old, and okay, so
But this is when the war started, roughly.
Uh-huh.
My mother got divorced.
Did the fact that the fact that your mother was more open to the ideas of the Nazis, that your mother embraced Nazism much more readily than, well, she didn't embrace it, but she was more accommodating. She went along with it more than your father did. Did that have something to do with their split?
No.
That had
No,
nothing
it was
to
the
do.
other way around. It was because she was all by herself. She needed some support. If she was willing to be accommodating, she had more opportunities and things like that. She needed a job.
Well, she just didn't fight it. I mean, my father was actually opposing it, but my mother just went along. But
Okay.
no, they didn't. That had nothing to do with the divorce.
Do you have any idea why they divorced?
Oh, they were just very, very different.
Right. Well, she was formally educated and beautiful, and he was an electrician that had gone to a trade school.
And that went
And
so
his
long.
father had been an innkeeper.
Yeah.
Now, getting back to her parents, what kind of people were her
Your
parents?
grandfather
My
published
I'm Beamter. He was
civil service.
a
He's a
civil servant.
Oh, okay. So
He
they
played
were
the piano. He was a cultured gentleman.
okay.
Oh yeah, he played the piano all day. He could play the piano and sort of like Tom does. He can make it he could make it fuse one piece into another, and he would play for hours and hours and hours.
And your maternal grandmother, the woman that he was married to, what was she like?
His step-grandmother.
My step-grandmother, she was a very, very elegant woman. She
And
was
what about
extremely
what about the original woman, with the first woman that your mother's actual
She
She
mother?
was no, I never knew her, but she was a midwife.
She was a midwife.
Yes.
So it was it was a high-ranking bureaucrat that played the piano and enjoyed culture that married a midwife.
Yes, but in those days that was also quite a bit of a...
Midwife was like having a nurse's degree then, right? It was
It was a very important social position.
okay. Okay.
In Brünn.
And they raised your mother in a middle class
Yes, my mother was very
German
carefully raised.
family.
She had nursery maids.
She went to the gymnasium then, right?
That didn't exist in those days. She went to the so-called Höhere Töchterschule.
Okay, good. Well, it was the equivalent at that time.
Whatever it was.
Whereas your father probably was not in a situation comparable to the gymnasium.
No.
Okay, so he was a trade working man, union brother all the way, and she was a conservative, a little bit higher in on the social ladder, and a little bit more
higher.
Conservative.
She was a very independent, beautiful woman at the time when they met. She was working for a newspaper in Pressburg.
Bratislava.
In Bratislava, she was a correspondent for a newspaper in Pressburg. And as I said, she spoke languages and she was educated and everything. And my grandfather was just a well-known gentleman in Brünn. He was just a well-known personage even.
Uh-huh.
And also,
How long did their marriage last?
Well, I am sort of the result of a intermediate reconciliation, but it didn't do it.
Naturally, you know the divorce is your fault. It's always the child's fault.
Whatever. But they had difficulties, I suppose, very soon.
Now, the Second World War comes along, the rise of Nazism. By this time, you're living with your mother.
Yes.
Did she and your mother continued to be enthusiastic about the rise of the Third Reich? And you were saying the other day, you were telling a story about how she had you in your mother had enrolled you in a choir
No,
or a little singing group that
But
sang.
she won a contest.
No, wrong, everything wrong. Every child starting 10 years old had to join the Hitler Youth. That was just the law. Every child had to do that. And so I had to do that too when I became 10, right? And because I sang so nicely, because I was such a cute little nice singer, this is why I was selected to join this radio choir. So I belonged to this choral group that was the radio choir. And so I sang at all occasions, wherever there was anything going on. Then the radio choir from the Jugendgruppe, from the Hitler Jugend would have to show up. I had the uniform, a blue skirt, a white blouse, and then it had a dark scarf and a leather knot. And so we used to sing all kinds of songs. Some of them were just ordinary German folk songs from the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and some were real Nazi songs. And I know them all. I'm just a walking documentary.
Do you have any recollections of what it was like to be in the Hitler Youth?
I loved it. Oh, it was wonderful.
Uh-huh.
I just loved it. I was 10 when all of this happened, and 12 when it was all over.
Did the children have any sense at all about some of the sinister things, some of the more sinister things that were going on among the Nazis?
They knew that the Jews had to wear a Star of David and that the Jews tended to disappear, and they thought, well, they just didn't know what to think of it, but they thought that there was some reasonable explanation for it.
Everybody assumed that there was a reasonable explanation because people generally trust the
A
government.
10-year-old child just doesn't question these things if you just don't question them.
But your mother, on the other hand, was an adult, and I wonder when she started, if and when she started realizing that maybe there was something very sinister about the Nazi Party. Did she ever indicate to you that she was losing her enthusiasm?
No.
Did she die before the war was over? Didn't
No,
she?
she died after.
Oh, interesting.
Way after.
Okay, so she died in 47?